Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and today we begin a powerful and deeply spiritual historical journey in our new series titled Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement, a story where empire, faith, politics, and mysticism intertwine in ways that shape the destiny of the Islamic world. This series will take you back to the early 16th century, a time of intense transformation, when the Ottoman Empire stood at the crossroads of conquest and conscience, and when Sultan Selim I, often remembered as Selim the Grim, rose to power as one of the most formidable rulers in Islamic history. Known for his iron will, military brilliance, and uncompromising nature, Selim is usually portrayed as a ruthless conqueror who expanded Ottoman territory at an astonishing pace, defeating the Safavids at Calderon, crushing the Mamluk Sultanate, and bringing the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman protection. But behind this fearsome image lies a deeper, more complex relationship with the spiritual currents of his time, especially the Sufi movements that were spreading rapidly across Anatolia, Persia, Arabia, and the broader Muslim world. Sufism was not merely a mystical path of personal devotion, it was a social force, a cultural bridge, and at times a political challenge that could unite masses or threaten imperial authority. During Sultan Selim's reign, Sufi orders such as the Naqshbandi, Mevlevi, Qadiri, and Bektashi held immense influence over ordinary people, warriors, scholars, and even royal courts, offering spiritual meaning in an age of war, uncertainty, and rapid change. At the same time, heterodox Sufi-inspired movements, especially those aligned with Shi'ite or Safavid ideology, became a source of deep anxiety for the Ottoman state, forcing Selim to confront a difficult question: how could an empire protect Orthodox Sunni Islam while managing the emotional and spiritual power of Sufi devotion? This series will explore how Sultan Selim navigated that tension, sometimes as a patron of respected Sufi scholars and saints, and at other times as a harsh suppressor of movements he saw as threats to unity and order. We will look beyond simple labels of hero or tyrant and try to understand Selim as a ruler shaped by his time, facing immense geopolitical pressure from rival empires, internal rebellions, and religious divisions that could tear his realm apart. Along the way, we will dive into the world of Sufi lodges, wandering dervishes, sacred poetry, and spiritual lineages that connected villages to capitals and hearts to heaven, showing how deeply Sufism influenced Ottoman society during Selim's rule. We will also examine how Selim's assumption of the caliphate after defeating the Mamluks changed the relationship between political power and spiritual authority, giving the Ottoman Sultan not just worldly dominance but symbolic leadership over the Sunni Muslim world. This introduction marks the beginning of a story that is not only about battles and borders, but about belief, identity, and the struggle to balance spiritual freedom with imperial control. If you are fascinated by Islamic history, mysticism, power struggles, and the hidden spiritual forces that move great empires, then this series is for you. So stay with me as we unfold the dramatic saga of Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement, where swords and prayers, fear and faith, conquest and contemplation all collide to shape a turning point in history. Part 1 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series begins by setting the stage in a world where political ambition and spiritual devotion were inseparable forces shaping everyday life. At the turn of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer just a rising power, it was a vast, complex state stretching across Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean, ruling over peoples of different languages, cultures, and religious traditions. Into this charged atmosphere was born Selim, the son of Sultan Bayezid II, a ruler known for his piety and relatively peaceful disposition. Selim grew up in a court where Islamic scholarship, Sufi poetry, and political intrigue coexisted, and from an early age he absorbed both the disciplined worldview of Sunni orthodoxy and the emotional, devotional currents flowing through Sufi culture. As a provincial governor in Trabzon, Selim came into direct contact with frontier life, where warriors, dervishes, and traders moved freely across borders, carrying not only goods and weapons but ideas, beliefs, and loyalties. It was here that Selim first witnessed the growing influence of Sufi-inspired movements among Turkoman tribes, many of whom were drawn to charismatic spiritual leaders rather than distant imperial authority. These early experiences shaped his understanding of Sufism as a double-edged force, capable of inspiring deep loyalty and moral strength, yet also able to mobilize rebellion if aligned against the state. During this period, Sufi orders were woven into the fabric of Ottoman society, operating texts and khanqahs that served as centers of worship, learning, charity, and community life. Dervishes traveled from village to village preaching humility, love of God, and devotion to spiritual masters, often attracting followers from the lower classes who felt alienated from rigid legalism or elite politics. While many of these orders supported Sunni Islam and respected Ottoman authority, others were influenced by Sharia ideas spreading from Persia under the Safavid dynasty, whose ruler Shah Ismail himself was revered by followers as a messianic figure with mystical powers. This blending of Sufism and political messianism alarmed Ottoman officials, especially Selim, who viewed the Safavids not only as military rivals but as ideological enemies capable of undermining loyalty within his realm. As Selim struggled for the throne against his brothers, the empire stood on the brink of internal fracture, with tribal revolts, court conspiracies, and religious tensions threatening stability. In this volatile environment, Selim's rise to power in 1512 marked a turning point, as he embraced a harsh but decisive style of rule aimed at enforcing unity and suppressing dissent. Yet even as he adopted the image of an uncompromising ruler, Selim did not reject spirituality, rather, he sought to control and channel it. He aligned himself with respected Sunni scholars and orthodox Sufi sheikhs, particularly those of the Naqshbandi order, known for emphasizing inner discipline, silent remembrance of God, and loyalty to Islamic law. Through this alliance, Selim attempted to present himself as the defender of true Islam, a ruler chosen to protect the faith from heresy and division. At the same time, he ordered severe measures against groups he believed were secretly loyal to the Safavids, viewing them as a direct threat to the survival of the empire. This early phase of Selim's reign reveals the central tension that would define his relationship with the Sufi movement: admiration for genuine spiritual discipline combined with deep fear of mystical charisma that could challenge political authority. Understanding this tension is essential to understanding Selim himself, not merely as a conqueror driven by ambition, but as a ruler operating in a world where faith could inspire obedience or rebellion with equal intensity. Part 1 thus introduces Sultan Selim as a man shaped by borderlands and belief, standing at the crossroads of sword and spirituality, preparing to confront forces that would test both his power and his vision of Islamic unity in the years to come. Part 2 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement series moves deeper into the storm of conflict that defined Selim's reign, revealing how spiritual allegiance became a matter of life, death, and imperial survival. After securing the throne, Selim faced a reality more dangerous than foreign armies alone: the silent spread of Safavid influence within Ottoman lands, carried not by soldiers but by poets, dervishes, and charismatic Sufi leaders who spoke directly to the hearts of the Turkoman tribes. These communities, long accustomed to semi-nomadic life and loose imperial control, were especially receptive to mystical language that promised divine justice, spiritual equality, and a messianic renewal of Islam. Shah Ismail of the Safavid state skillfully used this devotional fervor, presenting himself as both a political ruler and a sacred figure, inspiring unwavering loyalty that transcended borders. To Selim, this fusion of Sufism and Sharia ideology represented an existential threat, not simply because it challenged Ottoman rule, but because it undermined the Sunni religious framework upon which the empire's legitimacy rested. As reports of secret gatherings, symbolic rituals, and underground networks reached Istanbul, Selim responded with ruthless determination, ordering investigations and purges aimed at dismantling what he believed to be a hidden Safavid fifth column. Thousands were accused of heresy or treason, and while modern eyes may see these actions as brutal, within Selim's worldview they were acts of preservation, intended to prevent the empire from tearing itself apart from within. Yet even in this harsh climate, Selim did not wage war against Sufism as a whole; rather, he drew a sharp line between what he considered orthodox mystical practice and politically subversive devotion. Loyal Sufi orders continued to receive patronage, protection, and respect, their lodges functioning as stabilizing institutions that promoted obedience, moral discipline, and communal harmony. The Naqshbandi sheikhs in particular gained influence at court, advising the Sultan and reinforcing the idea that true spirituality must operate within the bounds of Islamic law and loyalty to legitimate authority. This selective support highlights Selim's strategic understanding of religion as a tool that could strengthen or weaken the state depending on how it was guided. The tension between repression and patronage reached its peak in the lead-up to the Battle of Calderon in 1514, where Selim confronted Shah Ismail directly on the battlefield. This clash was not merely a military engagement but a symbolic showdown between two visions of Islamic leadership, one rooted in Sunni orthodoxy and imperial order, the other in Sharia mysticism and charismatic devotion. Selim's decisive victory shattered the myth of Safavid invincibility, weakening the spiritual aura surrounding Shah Ismail and sending shockwaves through the Sufi networks that had supported him. In the aftermath, Selim tightened control over eastern Anatolia, restructuring religious institutions and reinforcing Sunni teachings to prevent a resurgence of Safavid-inspired movements. However, the victory also deepened Selim's awareness of the immense power of belief, convincing him that faith, if properly aligned, could be one of the empire's greatest assets. This realization shaped his policies as he turned south toward the Mamluk Sultanate, a realm that held not only political importance but immense spiritual significance as guardian of the holy cities. As Selim prepared for further conquest, he increasingly presented himself as a divinely guided ruler, chosen to defend the unity of Islam against fragmentation and corruption. Part 2 thus portrays a ruler locked in a struggle where swords alone were not enough, where poems, prayers, and loyalties mattered as much as armies, and where the Sufi movement stood at the heart of a battle over the soul of the Islamic world. Part 3 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series follows the dramatic transformation of Selim's authority after his eastern victories, as military conquest evolved into spiritual leadership and the relationship between the Ottoman state and Sufism entered a new phase. With the Safavid threat temporarily contained, Selim turned his attention toward the Mamluk Sultanate, whose control over Syria, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina carried immense symbolic weight in the Muslim world. The campaign against the Mamluks was framed not only as a political necessity but as a religious mission to restore unity and order to lands weakened by factionalism and decline. When Selim's forces defeated the Mamluks in rapid succession between 1516 and 1517, the consequences went far beyond territorial expansion. The transfer of the Abbasid Caliph's symbolic authority to Selim elevated the Ottoman Sultan from a regional ruler to the recognized leader of the Sunni Muslim world, fundamentally reshaping how spiritual power and imperial rule were intertwined. This new status intensified Selim's engagement with religious institutions, including Sufi orders, which now operated under the shadow of an empire that claimed both worldly and sacred legitimacy. In Cairo, Damascus, and the Hijaz, Selim encountered long-established Sufi traditions deeply embedded in urban life, linked to mosques, madrasas, and charitable endowments that served pilgrims, scholars, and the poor. Rather than dismantling these networks, Selim moved to incorporate them into the Ottoman system, confirming endowments, honoring respected sheikhs, and presenting himself as a patron of piety. This approach allowed him to project an image of a ruler who respected spiritual heritage while subtly asserting imperial oversight. At the same time, Selim remained cautious, aware that spiritual authority could never be fully controlled. He encouraged Sufi practices that emphasized personal discipline, humility, and adherence to Islamic law, while discouraging ecstatic rituals or claims of divine inspiration that might challenge orthodox doctrine or state authority. The balance he sought was delicate, to harness the moral influence of Sufism without allowing it to become a rival source of allegiance. In the holy cities, Selim's policies reflected this careful strategy. By improving infrastructure for pilgrims and ensuring the security of Sufi lodges along pilgrimage routes, he positioned the Ottoman state as the guardian of both physical and spiritual journeys. This not only strengthened his legitimacy but also linked the everyday devotional life of Muslims directly to imperial benevolence. Yet beneath this outward harmony lay unresolved tensions. Many Sufi communities, especially those with roots in popular or folk traditions, felt constrained by increasing regulation and the growing emphasis on orthodoxy. Selim's vision of unity left little room for ambiguity, and while his reign was short, the precedents he set would shape Ottoman religious policy for generations. His approach signaled a shift from tolerance born of distance to control born of proximity, as the empire now stood at the heart of the Islamic world. Part 3 reveals Sultan Selim not simply as a conqueror or suppressor, but as an architect of a new religious order, one in which Sufism was neither crushed nor free, but carefully woven into the fabric of imperial authority, setting the stage for lasting debates over spirituality, power, and the meaning of unity in Islam. Part 4 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series turns toward the inner contradictions of Selim's religious legacy, exploring how fear, devotion, control, and admiration coexisted within his policies and personal worldview. As the Ottoman Empire emerged as the dominant power of the Islamic world, Selim increasingly saw himself as a guardian standing between order and chaos, convinced that spiritual unity was as fragile as political stability. This conviction shaped his interactions with Sufi figures at every level of society, from celebrated scholars welcomed at court to wandering dervishes viewed with suspicion by officials. Selim understood that Sufism spoke a language that law and military authority could not, reaching into the emotional and moral lives of ordinary people, offering comfort in hardship and meaning in uncertainty. Rather than attempting to silence this voice, he sought to discipline it, believing that unregulated spirituality could slide into fanaticism or rebellion. This belief led to the strengthening of state oversight over Sufi lodges, endowments, and teaching lineages, bringing them more firmly under imperial administration. While many orthodox Sufi orders adapted to this framework and even benefited from imperial patronage, others felt marginalized, their practices labeled excessive or dangerous. Selim's reign thus marked a moment when spiritual expression began to be measured against political usefulness, a shift that would echo throughout later Ottoman history. At the personal level, accounts from contemporaries suggest that Selim himself was not indifferent to spiritual concerns. Despite his grim reputation, he reportedly respected ascetic discipline and valued scholars who emphasized inner struggle alongside outward obedience. Poetry attributed to him reflects themes of humility before God, transience of power, and the burden of rulership, revealing a ruler aware of the moral weight of his actions. This inner awareness did not soften his policies, but it adds depth to our understanding of his motivations. Selim did not see cruelty and piety as opposites. In his mind, harshness was sometimes a necessary tool to protect the greater spiritual order. This worldview created an atmosphere in which loyalty was equated with faith, and dissent with heresy, narrowing the space for alternative interpretations of devotion. Sufi leaders who aligned themselves clearly with Sunni orthodoxy and imperial authority found room to operate and influence society, while those who relied on popular charisma or mystical symbolism without clear doctrinal boundaries faced increasing pressure. Over time, this selective environment reshaped the Sufi landscape, privileging sobriety over ecstasy and discipline over spontaneity. Part 4 highlights how Selim's short but intense reign accelerated a transformation already underway, pushing Sufism toward a more regulated, institutionally defined role within the empire. His legacy in this realm is deeply ambiguous. He preserved Sufism by protecting it from outright suppression, yet constrained it by binding it to the state. In doing so, Selim helped create a model of religious governance that sought harmony through control, a model that would influence Ottoman rulers long after his death and continue to shape debates over spirituality and authority in the Islamic world. Part 5 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series brings the story toward reflection and consequence, examining how Selim's policies reshaped the spiritual landscape of the Ottoman world and left a legacy that outlived his brief reign. By the final years of his rule, the empire Selim commanded was vast, powerful, and ideologically unified in a way it had never been before, yet this unity came at the cost of diversity in spiritual expression. The integration of Sufi institutions into the machinery of the state had stabilized society, but it also transformed Sufism from a largely grassroots movement into a more formalized and supervised element of imperial culture. Lodges that once thrived on local charisma and popular devotion increasingly relied on official recognition, endowments, and legal approval, tying their survival to loyalty rather than solely to spiritual authority. For many Orthodox Sufi orders, this arrangement offered protection and prestige, allowing them to expand their networks and influence under the Ottoman banner. For others, especially those rooted in folk traditions or heterodox beliefs, the new order felt restrictive, forcing them either to conform, retreat into secrecy, or disappear altogether. Selim's death in 1520 marked the end of an era defined by urgency and uncompromising resolve, but the structures he created endured, shaping how his successors would engage with religion. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, these foundations were refined rather than dismantled, as the state continued to present itself as the ultimate guardian of both law and spirituality. In this sense, Selim's greatest impact on the Sufi movement was not immediate repression or patronage, but the establishment of a long-term framework in which mysticism was expected to serve social order and imperial unity. This expectation altered the tone of Ottoman Sufism, emphasizing ethical conduct, learning, and obedience over ecstatic experience or radical symbolism. Yet it would be a mistake to view this transformation solely as decline. Within the boundaries set by the state, Sufism continued to inspire poetry, music, architecture, and acts of charity, shaping the cultural soul of the empire. Mevlevi ceremonies, Naqshbandi teachings, and Qadiri traditions flourished in cities and courts, influencing generations of scholars and artists. At the same time, the memory of Selim's harsh measures served as a warning, reminding spiritual leaders of the dangers of entangling devotion with political ambition. Part 5 invites us to see Selim not only as a figure of his time but as a catalyst whose choices forced Sufism to redefine itself in relation to power. His reign stands as a moment when mysticism and empire confronted each other directly, negotiated their boundaries, and emerged permanently changed. The story of Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement is therefore not just a historical episode, but a lasting lesson about the delicate balance between inner faith and outer authority, a balance that continues to challenge societies wherever spiritual longing meets political power. Part 6 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series looks beyond Selim's lifetime to examine how memory, interpretation, and legacy reshaped his relationship with Sufism in the decades and centuries that followed. After Selim's death, stories about him circulated widely among scholars, poets, court chroniclers, and Sufi communities, each group interpreting his actions through its own lens. For state historians, Selim became the ideal ruler who saved Sunni Islam from fragmentation and secured the caliphate for the Ottomans, a man whose severity was justified by the magnitude of the dangers he faced. Within this narrative, Sufism appeared as a force wisely disciplined by a ruler who understood its power and dangers alike. Among many Sufi circles, however, Selim's memory was more complex and sometimes contradictory. Orthodox orders that had enjoyed his patronage remembered him as a protector of true spirituality, a ruler who honored scholars and saints while standing firm against what they saw as false mysticism. In their writings, Selim was portrayed as a stern but necessary guardian, someone who pruned the spiritual garden so that healthy traditions could flourish. In contrast, communities affected by repression preserved quieter memories, passed down through oral tradition and symbolic storytelling, where Selim appeared as a distant and fearful authority whose policies narrowed the space for spiritual freedom. These differing memories reveal how deeply Selim's reign marked the collective consciousness of the Islamic world, embedding debates about authority and devotion into cultural memory. Over time, the Ottoman state institutionalized a version of Sufism that reflected Selim's priorities, favoring orders that emphasized sobriety, scholarship, and loyalty, while discouraging those that relied heavily on ecstatic ritual or charismatic leadership. This environment shaped generations of Sufi thinkers, who increasingly articulated their teachings in ways that aligned with legal and theological norms, blending mysticism with jurisprudence and ethics. The result was a uniquely Ottoman synthesis in which Sufism became less confrontational and more integrated into everyday governance, education, and social welfare. Yet beneath this surface harmony, the tension Selim confronted never fully disappeared. Periodic revivals of popular mysticism, rural movements, and millenarian expectations reminded later rulers that spiritual energy could never be fully contained. In such moments, Selim's example was often invoked, either as a model to be followed or as a warning of excess. His reign thus became a reference point in ongoing discussions about how far a state should go in regulating belief. Part 6 also considers Selim's symbolic significance beyond Ottoman borders. In Safavid and Persian narratives, Selim was remembered as the embodiment of Sunni opposition, a powerful adversary whose victory at Calderon shattered a spiritual political dream. This contrast highlights how Sufism itself fractured along political lines, producing rival traditions shaped by different understandings of authority and sanctity. Selim's legacy, therefore, was not confined to Ottoman lands but influenced the broader Islamic world by reinforcing the division between state-aligned mysticism and revolutionary devotion. In reflecting on Selim's place in history, Part 6 emphasizes that his relationship with the Sufi movement cannot be reduced to simple categories of patron or persecutor. He was both, driven by a conviction that unity was sacred and disorder sinful. His policies forced Sufism to negotiate its role within power structures, prompting questions that remain relevant: can spirituality thrive under strict authority, and can a state embrace mysticism without fearing it? By tracing how Selim was remembered, reinterpreted, and debated long after his death, this chapter shows that his true impact lies not only in what he did, but in how his actions shaped the language through which faith and power continue to speak to one another. Part 7 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series turns toward the long shadow cast by Selim's era, focusing on how the boundaries he drew between authority and spirituality influenced everyday religious life within the Ottoman Empire. By the mid-16th century, the relationship between the state and Sufi orders had settled into a cautious rhythm shaped by Selim's precedents, where cooperation was encouraged but independence was quietly constrained. In cities like Istanbul, Bursa, Damascus, and Cairo, Sufi lodges became visible markers of imperial order as much as centers of devotion, their architecture, endowments, and rituals reflecting an unspoken agreement between mystics and rulers. These spaces offered education, shelter, music, and charity, yet they also served as points through which the state could observe and regulate spiritual life. For ordinary believers, this arrangement created a form of accessible spirituality that felt safe and familiar, grounded in respected traditions and endorsed by authority. The figure of the sheikh evolved accordingly, becoming less of a wandering visionary and more of a learned guide whose legitimacy rested on recognized lineage, scholarly credentials, and loyalty to the state. This shift reduced the likelihood of sudden spiritual movements erupting into political challenges, but it also narrowed the imaginative scope of popular devotion. The emphasis on sobriety and discipline reshaped rituals, privileging silent remembrance and ethical refinement over ecstatic expression and symbolic transgression. Music, poetry, and ceremony survived, but increasingly within boundaries defined as respectable and orthodox. At the same time, the memory of Selim's harsh interventions lingered as an unspoken warning, encouraging self-censorship among spiritual leaders and reinforcing the idea that faith should never openly confront power. Yet the human desire for direct, emotionally charged experiences of the divine did not disappear. In rural regions and among marginalized communities, alternative forms of devotion persisted, sometimes blending folk customs with Sufi symbolism in ways that remained outside official recognition. These practices rarely challenged the empire openly, but they preserved a parallel spiritual world that coexisted uneasily with state-sanctioned mysticism. The tension between these layers of religious life reveals the lasting impact of Selim's policies, which did not erase diversity but pushed it to the margins. Part 7 also explores how Ottoman intellectuals reflected on this balance, producing treatises and poetry that defended moderated Sufism as the ideal path, capable of nurturing inner faith without destabilizing society. In these works, Selim often appeared as a cautionary but necessary figure, someone whose severity had taught the empire the cost of neglecting spiritual order. This interpretation reinforced the belief that strong authority and regulated mysticism were mutually reinforcing, a lesson absorbed by later generations. Yet criticism also survived in subtle forms, embedded in allegory and metaphor, where poets hinted at the loss of spontaneity and spiritual daring. Through these quiet voices, we glimpse the emotional cost of stability, the longing for a more intimate and less supervised relationship with the divine. Part 7 concludes by showing that the world shaped by Selim was neither purely oppressive nor entirely harmonious, but a negotiated space where faith adapted to power and power learned to speak the language of faith. This uneasy balance defined Ottoman religious life for centuries, making Selim's reign a turning point not because it resolved the tension between spirituality and authority, but because it taught both sides how to live with it. Part 8 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series draws the narrative toward a broader philosophical reflection, examining how Selim's approach to spirituality and power continues to resonate beyond the Ottoman world and into modern discussions of faith and authority. By the time Selim's legacy had fully settled into historical memory, the model he helped establish had become deeply embedded in how empires and states thought about religion, not as a separate realm of private belief, but as a force that must be guided, framed, and, when necessary, restrained. Within the Ottoman Empire, this outlook encouraged a vision of Islam in which legal order, moral discipline, and mystical devotion reinforced one another under the watchful eye of the state. Sufism, once fluid and often unpredictable, became a stabilizing cultural current, shaping ethics, art, and community life while largely avoiding direct political confrontation. This transformation allowed Ottoman society to enjoy long periods of internal cohesion, but it also left unresolved questions about the limits of control over inner belief. The memory of Selim's reign served as both justification and warning whenever later rulers faced religious movements that blurred the line between devotion and dissent. Beyond Ottoman lands, Selim's legacy influenced how other Muslim polities viewed the relationship between rulers and mystics. His confrontation with the Safavids crystallized a division in the Islamic world, where state-aligned Sunni mysticism and revolutionary Sharia devotion followed different historical paths, each shaped by distinct understandings of authority, sanctity, and community. These divergent traditions carried forward debates that Selim's era had intensified, ensuring that questions about the political role of spirituality would remain central to Islamic history. Part 8 also invites reflection on how modern readers interpret Selim's actions. In contemporary scholarship, he is often re-examined not simply as a brutal ruler or a heroic defender of orthodoxy, but as a product of an age when belief and power were inseparable. His fear of uncontrolled spirituality may appear excessive today, yet it reflects a historical context in which religious movements could rapidly mobilize armies, overthrow dynasties, and redraw maps. Seen through this lens, Selim's policies reveal a deep anxiety about fragmentation, an anxiety shared by many rulers facing ideological challenges. At the same time, the human cost of this anxiety remains visible in the silenced voices and constrained expressions of devotion that his policies produced. Part 8 emphasizes that the story of Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement is ultimately about negotiation rather than domination, about the constant effort to balance inner freedom with collective order. This balance remains relevant in a world where states continue to grapple with the role of religion in public life. By tracing how Selim's decisions echoed across centuries, this chapter shows that his reign was not an endpoint but a beginning, marking a moment when mysticism and authority confronted each other openly and learned to coexist through tension rather than resolution. In this way, Selim's legacy endures as a reminder that spirituality cannot be erased by power, nor can power ignore spirituality without consequence, a lesson written into history through the complex and enduring relationship between empire and faith. Part 9 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement series turns inward toward the human dimension of faith under authority, exploring how Selim's era reshaped the personal spiritual lives of individuals living within the Ottoman world. Beyond policies, battles, and institutions, Selim's legacy was felt most deeply in the quiet choices people made about how to believe, whom to follow, and how openly to express devotion. For many ordinary Muslims, Sufi lodges remained places of refuge where prayer, companionship, and moral guidance softened the harshness of imperial life, yet these spaces now carried an unspoken awareness of boundaries. Devotion was encouraged, even admired, but only when it followed recognizable paths approved by scholars and officials. This atmosphere subtly changed how people related to spiritual authority, shifting trust from charismatic wanderers toward established sheikhs whose legitimacy rested on lineage and learning rather than visionary claims. The transformation did not eliminate spiritual passion, but it redirected it inward, encouraging believers to focus on personal ethics, self-discipline, and silent remembrance rather than dramatic displays of sanctity. In this sense, Selim's influence contributed to a form of inward mysticism that prized restraint as a virtue, framing self-control as the highest expression of faith. Yet this inward turn also produced feelings of loss among those who longed for a more immediate and emotionally intense connection to the divine. Stories circulated of earlier saints whose miracles and ecstatic experiences seemed distant from the regulated spirituality of the present, creating a quiet nostalgia for a time when faith felt wilder and less supervised. These emotions found expression in poetry and music, where metaphors of longing, separation, and hidden love hinted at the tension between inner desire and outer conformity. Through such cultural forms, individuals negotiated their spiritual identities, finding ways to preserve depth without inviting suspicion. Part 9 also considers how Selim's model influenced the moral imagination of society, reinforcing the idea that obedience, order, and unity were religious virtues. This mindset shaped family life, education, and communal relations, embedding a connection between faith and discipline into everyday norms. Children learned to respect religious authority alongside political authority, while scholars emphasized harmony between law and mysticism as the ideal path. Over generations, this synthesis produced a stable religious culture that valued continuity over innovation, offering security at the cost of experimentation. Yet stability itself became a spiritual value, interpreted as evidence of divine favor and social righteousness. In reflecting on these developments, Part 9 highlights the subtle power of Selim's legacy, which worked not only through force but through shaping expectations about what it meant to be a good believer. His reign taught society to internalize limits, transforming external control into self-regulation. At the same time, the persistence of poetic longing and quiet dissent reminds us that spiritual freedom cannot be fully contained, only redirected. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that Selim's impact on the Sufi movement was ultimately psychological as much as institutional, influencing how individuals experienced faith in their hearts as well as how it was practiced in public. Through this lens, the story of Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement becomes a story of inner negotiation, where belief adapts to power without losing its capacity for depth, resilience, and quiet resistance. Part 10 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement series brings the narrative to a reflective close, tracing the enduring impact of Selim's reign on the relationship between political authority and spiritual life and exploring how his policies shaped the Ottoman Empire for centuries to come. By the end of his rule, Selim had established a framework in which the state and Sufi institutions were bound together in a delicate balance. Spiritual life was neither suppressed nor left unchecked, but guided, disciplined, and integrated into the machinery of governance. This framework allowed the empire to maintain internal cohesion, project moral authority, and manage a vast, diverse population that stretched from the Balkans to the Hijaz. Within this structure, Sufi orders became vital organs of social, cultural, and religious life, offering education, charity, and guidance while reinforcing the boundaries of orthodoxy. For many, these institutions provided stability and a sense of connection to a larger spiritual order, demonstrating that devotion could coexist with loyalty to the state. Yet, as Part 10 emphasizes, Selim's legacy was never static. While orthodox Sufi orders flourished under his model, folk practices, ecstatic rituals, and localized spiritual movements continued at the margins, preserving alternative forms of devotion and reminding the empire that spirituality could never be fully contained. Poets, musicians, and dervishes kept alive a memory of freedom, ecstasy, and unmediated connection to the divine, ensuring that the cultural imagination retained room for wonder, longing, and subtle resistance. This tension between regulation and spontaneity became a defining feature of Ottoman religious life, shaping debates over morality, obedience, and innovation for generations. Selim's personal example, his combination of rigor, devotion, and fear of disorder, also influenced how future rulers approached religion. His successors often invoked his methods to justify interventions, whether in matters of doctrinal enforcement, patronage of scholars, or management of religious institutions. At the same time, intellectuals, chroniclers, and poets debated the moral cost of his severity, acknowledging that the preservation of order sometimes required personal cruelty and the suppression of passionate spirituality. Across the wider Islamic world, Selim's reign left parallel marks, particularly in the way Sunni and Shi'a movements defined themselves against one another. His confrontation with the Safavids crystallized a division that would endure politically, culturally, and spiritually, shaping alliances, rivalries, and devotional practices for centuries. Within this context, the story of Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement illustrates a broader truth: power and faith are never entirely separable, and the management of one inevitably shapes the expression of the other. The final chapter invites reflection on the human dimension of these historical forces. Ordinary believers, scholars, and saints all navigated the structures Selim created, learning to express devotion within limits while preserving personal meaning and spiritual depth. This negotiation transformed the character of Ottoman Islam, embedding self-discipline, ethical conduct, and respect for hierarchy as enduring values while allowing pockets of mystical freedom to persist. Part 10 closes the series by emphasizing that Sultan Selim's reign was not simply a historical episode of conquest or repression, but a turning point in the ongoing dialogue between authority and spirituality. By regulating, guiding, and sometimes confronting the Sufi movement, he helped define the contours of faith in a vast empire and left a legacy that shaped religious thought, cultural life, and political practice for generations. His story is ultimately a reminder that the tension between devotion and power is perennial, that stability often requires compromise, and that even in the strictest of regimes, the human heart finds ways to sustain wonder, longing, and resilience. Part 11 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement series delves into the nuanced cultural and intellectual repercussions of Selim's reign, examining how his policies toward Sufism shaped not only religious practice but also literature, philosophy, and social consciousness across the Ottoman world. By carefully supervising mystical orders while punishing heterodox elements, Selim created an environment in which Sufi thought became deeply interwoven with state-sanctioned intellectual traditions. Scholars and poets responded to this environment by producing works that reinforced ethical behavior, obedience to law, and measured spiritual reflection, often using allegory and symbolism to explore the complexities of devotion within the boundaries set by authority. Literature of the period frequently celebrated the virtues of discipline, patience, and humility, reflecting a spiritual culture tempered by political oversight, while also subtly preserving the memory of ecstatic freedom and mystical daring that had been constrained. The architecture of Sufi lodges, madrasas, and libraries further reflected Selim's influence, combining functional spaces for learning, worship, and charity with symbolic elements that communicated both spiritual aspiration and imperial oversight. Urban centers in Istanbul, Cairo, and Damascus became hubs where state, scholarship, and spirituality intersected, fostering a learned class of Sufi sheikhs who were both mystics and administrators. At the same time, rural and peripheral regions maintained forms of devotional practice less bound by formal recognition, creating a dynamic interplay between regulated spirituality and folk expression that preserved diversity within the empire. Part 11 also explores the subtle psychological imprint of Selim's reign on ordinary believers, who internalized the lessons of vigilance, discipline, and moral accountability, shaping personal devotion into a private yet structured practice. In families, communities, and educational settings, young Muslims learned to balance passionate faith with social responsibility, absorbing a worldview in which spiritual virtue was inseparable from adherence to law and respect for hierarchy. This internalization contributed to a distinctive Ottoman religious culture in which loyalty, ethics, and meditation were intertwined, and where the potential for subversive expression had to be carefully negotiated. Beyond culture and psychology, Selim's legacy also influenced political thought, as later rulers and scholars debated the proper relationship between power and sanctity. His victories against the Safavids and the Mamluks, combined with his careful management of Sufi institutions, became reference points for discussions about the responsibilities of a ruler to safeguard both temporal authority and spiritual integrity. These debates shaped administrative decisions, legal frameworks, and religious patronage for generations, embedding Selim's model into the empire's governing ethos. Yet even as his reign reinforced orthodoxy and order, the human drive for direct, emotionally resonant spirituality persisted, surfacing in poetry, music, and oral tradition, often in forms that avoided direct confrontation with authority. These currents kept alive a parallel spiritual imagination, reminding society that regulation could guide but never fully contain the longing for divine intimacy. Part 11 concludes by emphasizing that Sultan Selim's impact on the Sufi movement and the Ottoman world was multidimensional. He was a conqueror, a regulator, a patron, and a model whose actions reverberated through social, intellectual, and cultural life. His reign teaches that the interplay between authority and spirituality is not a single moment of domination but an ongoing negotiation, where power shapes faith, faith shapes culture, and both are mediated by human experience. By examining the enduring influence of his policies, the chapter reveals that Selim's era was not merely about conquest or control, but about the creation of a framework in which devotion, law, and moral imagination could coexist, producing a resilient yet disciplined spiritual culture that would define Ottoman life for centuries to come. Part 12 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series explores the long-term societal and spiritual consequences of Selim's reign, examining how his strategies of control, patronage, and discipline created patterns of religious life that persisted well beyond his death and shaped Ottoman culture in profound ways. By consolidating Sunni orthodoxy, integrating Sufi institutions into the state, and suppressing heterodox movements, Selim established a system in which spiritual authority was both honored and regulated, creating a model that balanced devotion with obedience and passion with discipline. This framework had far-reaching effects on how communities, scholars, and rulers approached religion. Sufi orders that adapted to this environment grew stronger and more influential, producing leaders who were at once spiritual guides, educators, and advisors, blending mystical insight with administrative acumen. Their teachings emphasized self-discipline, ethical conduct, and loyalty to both God and sovereign, reinforcing a moral order that extended into everyday life. The architectural and material culture of the time, mosques, lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations, reflected this integration, serving as tangible reminders that spirituality and governance were intertwined. Yet, Selim's reign also created subtle tensions. Folk traditions, ecstatic rituals, and heterodox practices continued in villages and remote areas, often operating quietly outside official recognition, preserving a form of spirituality that valued personal experience and emotional intensity over conformity. These parallel currents ensured that Sufism remained a living, dynamic force, capable of renewal even under the weight of imperial oversight. Part 12 further examines how Selim's policies shaped the moral imagination of the Ottoman populace. Ordinary believers internalized the lessons of discipline and loyalty, learning to navigate the boundaries between personal faith and social expectation. Education, family life, and communal practices reflected the idea that true devotion was inseparable from ethical behavior, respect for hierarchy, and recognition of the state's spiritual authority. In this sense, Selim's influence extended beyond institutional structures into the very psychology of belief, shaping the way generations of Muslims experienced and expressed their spirituality. Beyond the empire itself, Selim's approach left a lasting imprint on political and religious thought throughout the Islamic world. His confrontation with the Safavids exemplified the dangers of uncontrolled religious fervor and charismatic leadership, and his victories reinforced the notion that spiritual authority could not be divorced from political power. Sunni and Shiite communities internalized these lessons differently, contributing to enduring ideological and devotional divides that shaped regional dynamics for centuries. Part 12 also considers the cultural dimension of Selim's legacy, highlighting the ways in which literature, poetry, music, and ritual reflected the new balance between spiritual aspiration and regulation. Writers and poets engaged with the tension between inner longing and external discipline, producing works that celebrated moral refinement, ethical reflection, and contemplative devotion, while also subtly preserving memory of ecstatic, unbounded mystical experience. Music and ceremonial practices within Sufi orders were similarly adapted, structured to align with recognized norms while retaining expressive and symbolic depth. In reflecting on these transformations, Part 12 emphasizes that Selim's reign cannot be reduced to conquest, suppression, or patronage alone. His true legacy lies in creating a durable framework for the negotiation between faith and authority, one in which the moral, spiritual, and social dimensions of life were carefully balanced, producing a culture that was resilient, adaptive, and morally coherent. Even as new rulers modified, expanded, or interpreted his policies differently, the principles established during his era continued to guide interactions between state and Sufi institutions, shaping the development of Ottoman Islam for generations. The chapter concludes by asserting that the story of Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement is ultimately a story of negotiation, adaptation, and human experience. It is about the ways in which spiritual longing is expressed within structures of authority, how devotion can survive regulation, and how power and faith influence one another across time. By tracing the enduring influence of Selim's policies, Part 12 illuminates a crucial historical lesson, that the balance between spiritual freedom and political order is neither fixed nor absolute, but a continuous process in which culture, morality, and belief are constantly shaped, reshaped, and remembered. Part 13 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series examines the broader philosophical and social implications of Selim's reign, focusing on how his policies toward Sufism reshaped the understanding of authority, devotion, and the interplay between the state and individual conscience. By consolidating political and religious power, Selim set a precedent in which the ruler was not merely a temporal authority but also a guardian of spiritual order, a model that defined Ottoman governance for generations. Sufi orders, once independent and often unpredictable in their influence, were incorporated into the imperial framework in a way that allowed them to flourish while simultaneously circumscribing their autonomy. Orders such as the Naqshbandi, which emphasized silent remembrance, discipline, and adherence to Islamic law, became central to this vision, providing moral guidance, educational instruction, and administrative advice that reinforced both spiritual and civic order. The careful alignment of state and Sufi leadership created a culture in which religious devotion was encouraged, yet monitored, and where obedience to God was inseparable from loyalty to the Sultan. This integration had profound effects on social life, shaping norms, family structures, and communal ethics. Ordinary Muslims internalized the principles of discipline, moral responsibility, and measured devotion, learning to navigate their faith within the framework set by spiritual and political authorities alike. At the same time, spaces for personal mystical experience persisted, often in rural communities or in subtle cultural expressions such as poetry, music, and allegorical storytelling. These currents maintained a dynamic tension within Ottoman spirituality, ensuring that the emotional intensity and imaginative depth of Sufism continued even under regulation. Part 13 also considers the political dimension of Selim's religious policies, particularly his confrontation with the Safavids. By decisively opposing a movement that blended mystical charisma with political ambition, Selim demonstrated that spiritual fervor could not be separated from political consequences. His victory at Calderon and subsequent campaigns against the Mamluks reinforced the notion that religious authority and temporal power were mutually reinforcing, setting a model for both Sunni orthodoxy and imperial strategy. In the decades that followed, Ottoman rulers invoked Selim's methods as a template for managing religious dissent and for cultivating alliances with orthodox Sufi orders, illustrating the enduring relevance of his approach. Intellectual life under and after Selim's reign reflected these priorities, as scholars, poets, and theologians engaged with the challenges of harmonizing personal piety, mystical insight, and loyalty to the state. Writings emphasized moral education, ethical refinement, and the cultivation of inner discipline as essential to both spiritual and civic life, producing a culture in which Sufi practice and scholarly rigor were closely intertwined. Cultural expressions, including architecture, calligraphy, and ceremonial music, mirrored this synthesis, blending aesthetic beauty with moral and spiritual instruction. Yet Part 13 emphasizes that Selim's legacy was not purely about conformity or control. Despite strictures, creativity, emotional depth, and mystical longing continued to find expression within the parameters set by authority. The coexistence of structure and imagination became a defining feature of Ottoman religious life, illustrating that spirituality could adapt to political frameworks without losing its essential vitality. In reflecting on Selim's broader impact, this chapter highlights the enduring lessons of his reign, that authority and devotion are constantly negotiating their boundaries, that spiritual power can both support and challenge political power, and that cultural, moral, and psychological forces are deeply intertwined in shaping how societies experience faith. By tracing these interconnections, Part 13 shows that Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement was not merely a historical episode of suppression or patronage, but a formative moment in which the relationship between inner life and external order was consciously structured. His policies, strategies, and decisions created a model that influenced governance, religious practice, and cultural expression for centuries, shaping not only institutions but also the hearts and minds of those who lived under them. The story of Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement thus concludes as a profound reflection on the dynamics of power, belief, and human experience, demonstrating that the balance between authority and spirituality is never static, but continuously negotiated across generations, leaving traces in both collective memory and personal conscience. Part 14 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series delves into the transformative cultural, political, and spiritual ramifications of Selim's reign, tracing how his approach to Sufism and religious authority shaped the Ottoman Empire's identity and influenced the broader Islamic world. Selim's consolidation of power following his campaigns against the Safavids and Mamluks not only secured territorial expansion but also established a paradigm in which spiritual and temporal authority were inseparable, compelling Sufi orders to navigate a delicate balance between devotion and compliance. Under his rule, Sufi institutions became vital components of governance, providing moral guidance, education, and social cohesion, while simultaneously operating within frameworks defined by the state. Orders like the Naqshbandi and Qadiri thrived under this structure, emphasizing disciplined practice, ethical conduct, and legal adherence, which allowed them to serve as bridges between the populace and the ruling elite. By cultivating loyal Sufi networks, Selim transformed mysticism into a stabilizing force that reinforced imperial authority while preserving the spiritual vitality of Ottoman society. At the same time, he imposed clear limits on practices and communities perceived as politically subversive or doctrinally dangerous, particularly those with links to Shiraz Safavid ideology or unregulated ecstatic rituals. This dual approach, patronage coupled with repression, created a dynamic in which Sufism was neither completely autonomous nor entirely constrained, fostering an environment in which spiritual expression had to be negotiated and carefully framed within the boundaries of loyalty and orthodoxy. The social impact of this policy was profound. Ordinary believers absorbed the lessons of discipline, moral responsibility, and moderation, learning to internalize spiritual authority while maintaining personal devotion. The transformation was reflected in educational curricula, communal practices, and family life, instilling a culture in which ethical conduct and spiritual refinement were intertwined with civic responsibility. Poets, musicians, and storytellers responded creatively to these pressures, producing works that celebrated introspection, self-discipline, and devotion while subtly preserving echoes of the ecstatic and mystical freedoms that had been curtailed. Architecturally, Selim's reign left a lasting imprint through the construction and endowment of mosques, madrasas, Sufi lodges, and charitable foundations, spaces that simultaneously embodied spiritual ideals and conveyed the authority of the state. These physical sites became centers for learning, worship, and social service, reinforcing the integration of religious and political life and symbolizing the intertwined nature of devotion and governance that Selim had cultivated. On a political and strategic level, Selim's treatment of Sufi networks and spiritual movements shaped Ottoman relations with neighboring powers. His decisive confrontation with the Safavids at Calderon demonstrated the dangers of unregulated mysticism when combined with political ambition, reinforcing the notion that spiritual authority could have profound geopolitical consequences. Within the empire, his model of integrating Sufi orders into governance became a reference for later rulers, who saw the benefits of harnessing the moral and social influence of mysticism while maintaining oversight to prevent ideological disruption. Yet despite the constraints imposed by Selim, the human longing for direct, intense spiritual experience persisted. Folk traditions, popular rituals, and localized devotional practices continued in ways that complemented, rather than directly challenged, the official structures, preserving a parallel dimension of Ottoman spirituality. This coexistence of regulated and unregulated forms of devotion reflects the enduring complexity of Selim's impact. He strengthened, guided, and disciplined Sufism, but he also inadvertently ensured its resilience and adaptability. Part 14 emphasizes that Selim's legacy cannot be reduced to political conquest or doctrinal enforcement alone. It encompasses a holistic transformation of Ottoman religious, cultural, and social life. By framing the Sufi movement within a regulated yet spiritually fertile space, he created a model in which devotion could flourish in harmony with law and order, producing a cultural and moral framework that would endure for generations. The chapter concludes by reflecting on the broader significance of Selim's reign, highlighting the lessons it offers about the interplay between authority and faith, the negotiation of spiritual autonomy under political power, and the ways in which culture, devotion, and governance shape one another. Through these intertwined legacies, Sultan Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement emerges as a defining moment in Ottoman history, illustrating the enduring tension and synergy between human spirituality and institutional authority, and demonstrating how a ruler's vision can leave an indelible imprint on both hearts and structures for centuries. Part 15 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series examines the long-term institutional, cultural, and psychological effects of Selim's engagement with Sufism, exploring how his reign reshaped the Ottoman Empire's conception of spiritual authority and influenced both governance and individual practice for generations. By consolidating Sunni orthodoxy and integrating Sufi orders into the administrative and moral framework of the empire, Selim established a precedent in which spiritual and temporal power were mutually reinforcing, creating a system in which Sufi institutions became both centers of devotion and instruments of social cohesion. The Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and Mevlevi orders, among others, adapted to this environment, emphasizing disciplined practice, ethical refinement, and alignment with state objectives, thereby ensuring their survival and institutional growth. Sufi lodges, educational centers, and charitable foundations flourished under imperial patronage, becoming nodes of moral instruction, community organization, and spiritual cultivation that linked ordinary believers to a wider network of guidance and oversight. Selim's policies also imposed boundaries on heterodox and unregulated practices, particularly those that threatened political or doctrinal unity. This balance of patronage and regulation encouraged conformity and orthodoxy while leaving room for creative expression within defined limits, resulting in a cultural environment where devotion was both disciplined and meaningful. On a social level, the Sultan's strategies shaped everyday life and personal spirituality. Families, schools, and local communities internalized the lessons of order, moral accountability, and obedience, creating a culture in which ethical conduct was inseparable from spiritual aspiration. Ordinary Muslims learned to navigate the tension between inner devotion and outward conformity, cultivating a form of piety that was introspective, disciplined, and socially responsible. Poetry, music, and allegorical storytelling preserved emotional and imaginative dimensions of spirituality, allowing believers to experience depth and ecstasy within a regulated framework. Architecturally and culturally, Selim's influence endured in the construction of lodges, mosques, and libraries that combined aesthetic beauty with ethical and spiritual instruction, creating physical spaces that embodied the synthesis of devotion and authority. The moral and intellectual imprint of his reign extended to the broader Ottoman elite, shaping the education of scholars, administrators, and spiritual leaders who learned to balance mystical insight with legal knowledge, and personal devotion with loyalty to the state. Politically, Selim's reign provided a model for managing the interplay between religious movements and imperial power. His decisive confrontation with the Safavids and his careful regulation of Sufi networks demonstrated that unbridled spiritual influence could have tangible political consequences, and his victories reinforced the principle that state and faith were deeply interconnected. Later Ottoman rulers invoked his example to justify interventions, patronage, and oversight, embedding his methods into the empire's governing ethos. Yet despite these constraints, the human desire for intimate, ecstatic, and personal spiritual experience persisted. Folk rituals, localized devotional practices, and poetic expressions continued to thrive in ways that complemented rather than openly challenged the state-sanctioned order, preserving an undercurrent of vitality, emotion, and creative imagination within Ottoman spiritual life. Part 15 emphasizes that the lasting significance of Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement lies not only in institutional or political outcomes but also in the psychological and cultural effects on believers, communities, and intellectual life. By structuring the relationship between authority and faith, he reshaped the way spirituality was understood, practiced, and internalized, producing a model in which devotion was both disciplined and deeply resonant. The chapter concludes by reflecting on Selim's enduring legacy, a world in which mystical experience, ethical conduct, and political order were intertwined, where obedience and introspection coexisted with longing and creativity, and where the negotiation between inner faith and outer authority became a defining feature of Ottoman life. His reign demonstrates that the dialogue between power and spirituality is ongoing, complex, and multifaceted, leaving traces in institutions, culture, and personal conscience that continue to inform the study of religion, governance, and human experience for centuries. Part 17 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series explores the lasting socio-political and cultural ramifications of Selim's reign, focusing on the ways in which his strategies toward Sufi orders and religious authority shaped not only the Ottoman state but also the daily spiritual lives of its subjects. Selim's decisive approach to integrating Sufi institutions into the framework of governance created a precedent in which spiritual practice was encouraged, yet carefully circumscribed, producing a form of mysticism that emphasized ethical conduct, disciplined devotion, and loyalty to both God and sovereign. Orders such as the Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and Mevlevi were central to this vision, serving as hubs of moral instruction, education, charitable work, and cultural production, while also acting as intermediaries between the populace and the state. This integration allowed the empire to benefit from the social and spiritual authority of Sufi leaders, harnessing their influence to reinforce cohesion and public order, while simultaneously guiding mystical practices within the boundaries of orthodoxy and imperial oversight. The policies of Selim shaped the moral imagination of society, teaching ordinary believers to internalize the principles of self-discipline, ethical responsibility, and measured devotion. Education, family life, and communal structures reinforced these lessons, embedding the expectation that true piety was inseparable from adherence to law and social norms. Poetry, music, and allegorical storytelling preserved deeper emotional and mystical currents, allowing believers to experience spiritual depth within the structured framework established by Selim's governance. Architecturally, Sufi lodges, mosques, and educational institutions were designed to reflect this synthesis of spiritual aspiration and disciplined order, combining functional spaces for worship, study, and charity with symbolic motifs that communicated the moral and ethical ideals of the period. Politically, Selim's confrontation with heterodox and potentially subversive movements, particularly the Safavids, demonstrated the inseparability of religious and temporal authority. His victory at Calderon and subsequent campaigns against the Mamluks reinforced the notion that unregulated spiritual influence could carry tangible consequences, establishing a model for managing ideological and devotional diversity within the empire. Later rulers drew upon Selim's strategies when negotiating their own relationships with Sufi orders, balancing patronage, guidance, and oversight to maintain stability while preserving the vitality of mystical practice. Part 17 also emphasizes the psychological and cultural dimensions of Selim's policies. While institutionalized Sufism promoted reflection, discipline, and ethical development, the human longing for ecstatic, immediate, and personal experience of the divine persisted in less formal contexts. Folk rituals, regional devotional practices, and creative expressions in music and poetry continued to thrive, creating a parallel spiritual landscape that coexisted with the official framework. This dynamic illustrates that Selim's influence, while profound, did not extinguish the imaginative and emotional dimensions of devotion. Rather, it channeled them into enduring, adaptive forms that could survive within a regulated society. Intellectual life during and after Selim's reign reflected these tensions. Scholars, theologians, and poets engaged with questions about the balance between inner spiritual experience and outward conformity, producing works that emphasized ethical cultivation, moral reflection, and disciplined meditation, while preserving symbolic and artistic spaces for mystical longing. This interplay between structure and imagination became a defining feature of Ottoman cultural and religious life, ensuring both stability and vitality within the empire's spiritual framework. Part 17 concludes by underscoring that Sultan Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement was transformative not merely in terms of conquest or regulation, but in shaping the moral, intellectual, and spiritual architecture of the Ottoman world. By guiding and disciplining mystical practice, he created a model in which ethical devotion, cultural production, and social cohesion were intertwined, producing a society in which faith, governance, and personal piety were mutually reinforcing. His legacy demonstrates the enduring negotiation between authority and spirituality, showing that devotion can adapt, persist, and flourish even under oversight, and illustrating the complex ways in which culture, morality, and human experience are shaped by the interaction between power and faith. Part 18 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series examines the profound and multifaceted legacy of Selim's reign on Ottoman religious, cultural, and intellectual life, focusing on the ways in which his policies toward Sufi orders transformed not only the structure of spiritual authority but also the everyday experience of faith across the empire. By consolidating Sunni orthodoxy and integrating Sufi institutions into the state apparatus, Selim established a model in which political power and mystical influence were mutually reinforcing, creating an environment where spiritual practice could thrive under guidance while simultaneously serving the broader goals of social cohesion and moral order. Orders such as the Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and Mevlevi became central pillars of this structure, offering education, ethical instruction, charitable support, and cultural leadership, while also functioning as intermediaries between ordinary believers and the Sultan. The alignment of mystical authority with state objectives not only strengthened imperial control but also produced a spiritual culture in which devotion was inseparable from discipline, ethical conduct, and loyalty, embedding a moral framework that extended from urban centers to rural communities. At the same time, Selim's policies imposed limits on heterodox and potentially disruptive practices, particularly those influenced by Safavid Sharia ideology or unregulated ecstatic traditions, demonstrating a clear understanding that unchecked spiritual movements could challenge both doctrinal cohesion and political stability. This balance of patronage and regulation created a dynamic in which Sufism was simultaneously protected and directed, allowing for both continuity and adaptation, and ensuring that mystical practice remained a vital, guiding force in the empire without threatening the authority of the Sultan. On a cultural level, Selim's influence manifested in literature, poetry, music, and architectural expression. Scholars and poets of the period navigated the tension between inner mystical experience and outward conformity, producing works that emphasized moral reflection, ethical cultivation, and disciplined devotion while preserving subtle channels for emotional depth and imaginative exploration. Sufi lodges, mosques, and educational institutions became physical embodiments of these values, spaces where worship, learning, and communal life intersected, reinforcing both spiritual aspiration and the hierarchical order established by the state. Ordinary believers internalized the principles of ethical responsibility and measured devotion, learning to cultivate their spiritual lives in ways that harmonized personal piety with social and civic obligations. At the same time, folk rituals, regional practices, and localized devotional expressions persisted outside the strict oversight of state-aligned Sufi orders, preserving the emotional intensity, ecstatic experiences, and imaginative freedom that formed the deeper undercurrents of Ottoman spiritual culture. Politically, Selim's confrontations with the Safavids and the careful management of internal Sufi networks established a precedent for the relationship between faith and governance. His victories underscored the potential consequences of unregulated mystical authority and provided a framework for later rulers to balance support and supervision, cultivating loyalty while limiting ideological threats. This model influenced administrative, educational, and religious strategies for generations, embedding Selim's vision into the empire's approach to both internal and external challenges. Psychologically and socially, the reign of Selim produced a population attuned to the negotiation between inner devotion and outward conformity. Believers learned to reconcile personal spiritual longing with adherence to orthodoxy and the expectations of communal life, producing a society in which moral discipline, ethical reflection, and spiritual aspiration were deeply intertwined. Part 18 highlights that the true significance of Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement lies in its long-term, multidimensional effects, shaping institutions, influencing cultural production, guiding intellectual discourse, and transforming personal experience. His reign demonstrates that authority and spirituality are constantly in dialogue, that devotion can adapt and persist even under oversight, and that ethical and mystical life can coexist with the demands of political order. By structuring the relationship between mystical practice and governance, Selim left a legacy in which faith, culture, and authority were mutually reinforcing, illustrating the enduring negotiation between inner longing and external control, and showing how human experience, imagination, and morality are continuously shaped by the interplay of power and devotion. Part 19 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series explores the enduring spiritual, cultural, and political dimensions of Selim's reign, focusing on how his relationship with the Sufi orders reshaped both the Ottoman Empire's institutions and the inner lives of its subjects. By consolidating Sunni orthodoxy and integrating Sufi institutions into the state's administrative and moral framework, Selim created a model in which spiritual authority became an extension of political power, reinforcing governance while simultaneously nurturing the devotional life of the population. Sufi orders such as the Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and Mevlevi thrived under this system, serving as centers of education, ethical guidance, and social service, while mediating between ordinary believers and the imperial court. The integration of these orders into the political and cultural fabric of the empire not only strengthened institutional cohesion but also transformed the practice of mysticism, emphasizing discipline, moral responsibility, and adherence to law as essential aspects of devotion. Selim's policies simultaneously constrained heterodox or unregulated spiritual practices, particularly those associated with Shiraz Safavid influence or ecstatic ritual expression, demonstrating a strategic awareness of the potential for unmonitored mystical movements to disrupt both doctrinal and political stability. This dual approach of patronage and regulation created an environment in which Sufism could flourish within clearly defined boundaries, allowing spiritual expression, intellectual inquiry, and ethical cultivation to coexist under imperial oversight. On a social and psychological level, ordinary Muslims internalized the principles of ethical and disciplined devotion, learning to balance personal spiritual longing with the expectations of law, hierarchy, and community. Families, educational institutions, and local communities became arenas in which these values were instilled and practiced, producing a society in which morality, spirituality, and civic responsibility were inseparable. At the same time, emotional and imaginative forms of devotion persisted through folk rituals, localized spiritual practices, poetry, and music, maintaining a dynamic tension between regulated orthodoxy and personal mystical experience. Architecturally and culturally, Selim's influence was evident in the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations, which embodied both aesthetic beauty and moral instruction. These spaces served as tangible reminders of the intertwining of spiritual aspiration with social and political order, while also providing venues for education, contemplation, and communal support. The cultural and intellectual impact of Selim's reign extended into literature, philosophy, and the arts, where scholars, theologians, and poets engaged with the challenge of harmonizing inward mystical reflection with outward social conformity. Their works emphasized ethical cultivation, measured devotion, and disciplined meditation, while also preserving symbolic and allegorical spaces for emotional depth and creative imagination. Politically, Selim's handling of Sufi orders and heterodox movements established precedents that shaped Ottoman governance for generations. His confrontation with the Safavids and the careful supervision of internal spiritual networks demonstrated the inseparability of religious and political authority, illustrating that unregulated mystical influence could have tangible consequences for state stability. Later rulers followed his example, balancing patronage with oversight and cultivating loyal, disciplined religious networks while managing dissent. Part 19 underscores the enduring tension and interplay between structured authority and human spirituality. Even as Selim's policies guided devotion within clear parameters, the persistence of emotional, ecstatic, and localized spiritual practices ensured that Ottoman Sufism retained vitality, adaptability, and depth. This dynamic illustrates that while authority can shape, channel, and discipline faith, it cannot extinguish the fundamental human longing for intimate connection with the divine. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that Sultan Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement was transformative not only in political or institutional terms but also in shaping cultural, moral, and psychological life across the empire. His reign produced a society in which spiritual discipline, ethical conduct, and civic responsibility were closely intertwined, and in which the negotiation between inner devotion and outward conformity became a defining feature of Ottoman religious experience. By structuring the relationship between faith and authority, Selim left a legacy in which spirituality could flourish within boundaries, creating a resilient, adaptive, and deeply moral culture that influenced generations, shaped institutions, and left an indelible imprint on both hearts and structures. Part 20 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series draws together the culmination of Selim's policies, their enduring legacy, and the ways in which his engagement with Sufi orders shaped the Ottoman Empire's spiritual, cultural, and political landscape for generations to come. Sultan Selim's reign was marked by decisive action, both in military conquest and in the regulation of religious life, and it was within this dual context of power and piety that the Sufi movement found both opportunity and constraint. By integrating Sufi institutions into the administrative and moral fabric of the empire, Selim created a system in which mystical authority was honored, cultivated, and strategically aligned with state objectives, ensuring that these orders functioned as stabilizing agents of social cohesion, moral instruction, and cultural continuity. The Naqshbandi, Qadiri, Mevlevi, and other prominent orders were central to this system, providing education, guidance, and charitable works while also mediating between ordinary believers and the Sultan, reinforcing a model in which loyalty, ethical conduct, and spiritual discipline were inseparable. Selim's policies also delineated clear boundaries for acceptable practice, curbing heterodox or politically threatening movements, particularly those influenced by Shura Safavid ideology or ecstatic, uncontrolled rituals. This careful balancing of patronage and regulation allowed Sufism to flourish institutionally while remaining aligned with orthodoxy, producing a form of devotion that emphasized reflection, ethical refinement, and disciplined practice without extinguishing spiritual vitality. On a social level, Selim's interventions shaped the moral and psychological landscape of the empire. Believers learned to internalize the values of self-discipline, obedience, and ethical responsibility, harmonizing personal spiritual longing with communal and civic expectations. Families, educational institutions, and local communities became centers for the transmission of these values, producing a society in which devotion, morality, and civic duty were deeply intertwined. Cultural expressions, poetry, music, oral storytelling, and artistic production, both reflected and reinforced these principles while preserving subtle currents of emotional depth, mystical imagination, and ecstatic experience that existed alongside the structured orthodoxy of state-aligned Sufi practice. Architecturally, Selim's reign left enduring marks through the construction of lodges, mosques, madrasas, and charitable institutions that combined aesthetic beauty, spiritual symbolism, and functional spaces for education, worship, and communal service. These physical structures symbolized the integration of spiritual aspiration and social order, embedding the moral and ethical priorities of Selim's reign into the built environment and into everyday life. Politically, Selim's engagement with Sufi orders and his decisive actions against the Safavids and other heterodox elements established precedents that would shape Ottoman governance for generations. His victories illustrated the inseparability of spiritual authority and political power, highlighting the potential consequences of unregulated mystical influence, while his oversight of Sufi networks provided a model for balancing autonomy, loyalty, and institutional alignment. Later sultans and administrators drew on his methods to cultivate compliant and morally oriented religious networks while managing ideological diversity, embedding Selim's approach into the empire's broader governing ethos. Part 20 also reflects on the enduring tension between regulation and personal devotion. Despite the disciplined framework established by Selim, emotional, ecstatic, and localized forms of mystical expression continued to thrive, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of human spirituality. Folk rituals, regional practices, and poetic expression preserved the imaginative and emotional depth of Sufi life, ensuring that devotion remained alive, intimate, and transformative, even under the constraints of state oversight. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's reign represents a pivotal chapter in Ottoman history, not only in terms of conquest and political consolidation but also in the shaping of religious, cultural, and ethical life. By structuring the relationship between mystical practice and governance, he created a society in which spiritual discipline, ethical responsibility, and social cohesion were mutually reinforcing, producing a resilient, adaptive, and morally coherent culture. His legacy demonstrates the ongoing negotiation between authority and devotion, showing that while power can guide and shape faith, it cannot extinguish the fundamental human longing for divine connection, and that spirituality, creativity, and ethical reflection continue to find expression even within the most structured and regulated frameworks. Part 20 thus serves as both a culmination and reflection on Selim's enduring influence, illuminating the intricate interplay of politics, religion, and culture that defined his era and continued to resonate across generations. Part 21 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series examines the profound and enduring consequences of Selim's reign on the spiritual, social, and political fabric of the Ottoman Empire, highlighting how his policies toward Sufi orders and religious authority created a lasting framework for the integration of faith and governance. Selim's vision of a centralized and disciplined religious order intertwined with state power allowed Sufi institutions to flourish while remaining aligned with imperial objectives, reinforcing the moral and social cohesion of the empire. The Naqshbandi, Qadiri, Mevlevi, and other prominent orders became crucial mediators between the populace and the Sultan, offering guidance, education, and charitable services, while simultaneously ensuring that mystical practice supported loyalty, ethical conduct, and social stability. By consolidating Sunni orthodoxy and regulating heterodox practices, particularly those influenced by Shura Safavid ideology or ecstatic, unmonitored rituals, Selim established a model in which spiritual authority and political oversight operated in tandem, allowing mysticism to enrich daily life without challenging the authority of the state. This dual approach shaped the psychological and social life of ordinary believers, who internalized principles of moral discipline, self-restraint, and devotion that were harmonized with civic responsibility and communal norms. Families, local communities, and educational institutions all participated in transmitting these values, producing a society in which ethical conduct and spiritual aspiration were inseparable, and in which devotion was expressed through both personal reflection and public practice. Cultural life under Selim reflected this integration of spirituality and regulation. Poetry, music, storytelling, and other artistic forms engaged with the tension between personal mystical experience and the disciplined frameworks of state-aligned Sufism, producing works that emphasized ethical cultivation, contemplative reflection, and measured devotion while retaining channels for emotional depth, imaginative expression, and ecstatic resonance. Architectural achievements, including Sufi lodges, mosques, madrasas, and charitable foundations, embodied the moral, spiritual, and civic ideals of the period, providing spaces where education, worship, communal support, and contemplation intersected in ways that reinforced both personal piety and social cohesion. Politically, Selim's engagement with Sufi orders and his suppression of potentially subversive movements established precedents for balancing religious influence with state authority. His decisive confrontation with the Safavids and his management of internal spiritual networks demonstrated the inseparability of religious and temporal power, highlighting that unregulated mystical authority could have tangible consequences for political stability, while disciplined Sufi networks could serve as stabilizing and legitimizing forces. Later sultans drew upon his methods to cultivate loyal, morally oriented religious institutions while managing ideological diversity, embedding Selim's approach into the empire's enduring governing ethos. Despite the structured oversight imposed on Sufi practice, human longing for ecstatic, intimate, and personal experiences of the divine persisted. Folk rituals, local devotional practices, and artistic expression continued to thrive alongside state-sanctioned orders, preserving the imaginative and emotional dimensions of spirituality. This coexistence of regulation and freedom illustrates the resilience and adaptability of mystical practice, demonstrating that devotion can survive, evolve, and flourish even under constraints. Part 21 also emphasizes the long-term intellectual and moral impact of Selim's reign. Scholars, poets, and theologians engaged with the challenges of balancing inner spiritual life with outward conformity, producing literature and discourse that highlighted ethical reflection, disciplined meditation, and moral education while retaining symbolic and imaginative spaces for mystical exploration. The psychological and cultural imprint of these developments endured across generations, shaping the expectations, experiences, and spiritual practices of both elites and common people throughout the empire. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's reign represents a transformative moment in Ottoman history, not only in terms of political consolidation and territorial expansion but also in the structuring of religious, cultural, and ethical life. By integrating mystical practice with state authority, he created a society in which devotion, moral responsibility, and social cohesion were deeply intertwined, producing a resilient and adaptive culture that endured well beyond his lifetime. Part 21 underscores the ongoing negotiation between power and faith, showing that while authority can shape and channel spirituality, it cannot extinguish the fundamental human drive for divine connection, and that ethical, imaginative, and devotional life continues to find expression even within structured frameworks. Selim's legacy thus endures as a testament to the intricate interplay between governance, religion, and culture, illuminating the ways in which spiritual practice can be guided, preserved, and made to resonate across generations. Part 22 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi movement series explores the enduring cultural, spiritual, and institutional consequences of Selim's reign, emphasizing how his approach to Sufi orders and religious authority reshaped the Ottoman Empire's moral and social landscape while leaving an indelible imprint on its political and intellectual life. Sultan Selim's consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy and his strategic integration of Sufi institutions into the administrative and moral frameworks of the state created a model in which mystical authority became both a stabilizing force and a guiding principle for ethical and civic conduct. Orders such as the Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and Mevlevi were particularly instrumental in this system, functioning as centers of education, spiritual guidance, charitable activity, and social mediation while also reinforcing loyalty and alignment with the Sultan's objectives. This alignment of spiritual and political authority ensured that mysticism contributed to societal cohesion and moral discipline, transforming the role of Sufi networks from independent mystical communities into integral components of Ottoman governance. At the same time, Selim's policies imposed clear boundaries on heterodox or politically disruptive movements, especially those influenced by Safavid ideology or ecstatic, unregulated practices, demonstrating a keen awareness of the potential consequences of unchecked mystical authority. By combining patronage with regulation, Selim cultivated an environment in which devotion, creativity, and moral instruction could coexist within a framework that reinforced both orthodoxy and loyalty, producing a spiritual culture that was disciplined, adaptive, and resilient. Socially, these policies had far-reaching implications. Ordinary Muslims internalized principles of ethical behavior, moral responsibility, and disciplined devotion, learning to harmonize personal spiritual aspirations with communal norms and civic obligations. Families, local communities, and educational institutions became vital channels for the transmission of these values, producing a society in which morality, spirituality, and social responsibility were deeply intertwined. Cultural expressions, literature, poetry, music, storytelling, and other artistic forms, engaged with the tension between regulated orthodoxy and personal mystical experience, preserving channels for emotional depth, imaginative reflection, and ecstatic resonance even as institutional Sufism provided structure and guidance. Architecturally and materially, Selim's reign left a lasting legacy through the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations, which combined functional purpose with symbolic meaning, embedding moral and spiritual ideals into the physical and social fabric of the empire. Politically, his strategies established a model for balancing religious influence and state authority. By decisively confronting the Safavids and carefully supervising internal Sufi networks, Selim demonstrated the inseparability of spiritual and temporal power, showing that unregulated mystical authority could have tangible consequences for political stability, while disciplined and loyal Sufi orders could act as stabilizing and legitimizing forces. Later Ottoman rulers adopted and adapted these methods, cultivating compliant and ethically oriented religious networks while managing ideological diversity and preserving the vitality of mystical practice. Part 22 also emphasizes the psychological and spiritual dimensions of Selim's policies. While state-aligned Sufism promoted disciplined reflection, ethical conduct, and structured devotion, human longing for intimate, ecstatic, and immediate experiences of the divine persisted, finding expression in local rituals, folk practices, and poetic and musical forms that operated alongside the official institutions. This coexistence of oversight and freedom illustrates the resilience and adaptability of mystical life, showing that spiritual experience can thrive even under regulation and that devotion retains its emotional and imaginative depth despite structured frameworks. The intellectual and cultural influence of Selim's reign extended to scholars, poets, and theologians, who engaged with the tension between personal mystical insight and public conformity, producing works that emphasized ethical cultivation, moral reflection, and disciplined meditation while maintaining allegorical and symbolic spaces for creativity, contemplation, and emotional engagement. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement represents a transformative chapter in Ottoman history, shaping not only political authority and territorial control but also the moral, spiritual, and cultural dimensions of society. By integrating mystical practice into governance, he created a resilient and adaptive model in which ethical devotion, social cohesion, and spiritual aspiration were mutually reinforcing, producing a lasting cultural, intellectual, and religious legacy. Part 22 underscores the enduring negotiation between authority and spirituality, demonstrating that while power can guide, structure, and shape mystical practice, it cannot extinguish the innate human desire for connection with the divine, and that creativity, reflection, and ethical growth continue to find expression within both institutional and personal frameworks. Selim's vision thus left an imprint that shaped generations, influencing institutions, culture, and individual conscience across the Ottoman world. Part 23 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series delves into the long-term spiritual, social, and cultural ramifications of Sultan Selim's policies, emphasizing how his engagement with Sufi orders reshaped the Ottoman Empire's religious landscape while leaving an enduring mark on intellectual, ethical, and civic life. Selim's strategic consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy and integration of mystical institutions into the state's administrative and moral framework created a model in which spiritual authority reinforced political power, establishing a system where Sufi orders functioned both as centers of devotion and as instruments of social cohesion and governance. The Naqshbandi, Qadiri, Mevlevi, and other influential orders became crucial nodes in this structure, providing education, moral guidance, charitable services, and mediation between the populace and the state, ensuring that mystical practice was aligned with ethical conduct, social stability, and loyalty to the Sultan. By combining patronage with oversight, Selim fostered an environment in which Sufism could flourish institutionally while remaining harmonized with orthodoxy, encouraging disciplined devotion, reflection, and ethical cultivation without suppressing the spiritual vitality and imaginative depth that characterized mystical practice. At the same time, he imposed limits on heterodox and potentially destabilizing movements, particularly those influenced by Safavid Shari'a ideology or unregulated ecstatic rituals, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of the interplay between religious authority, social order, and political power. On the social level, these policies shaped the daily spiritual and ethical lives of ordinary Muslims, who were guided to internalize principles of self-discipline, moral responsibility, and devotion that were inseparable from communal norms and civic obligations. Families, local communities, and educational institutions became conduits for these teachings, producing a society in which ethical behavior, spiritual cultivation, and social harmony were deeply intertwined. Cultural expression flourished within this framework, as poets, musicians, and storytellers engaged with the tension between personal mystical experience and institutionalized orthodoxy, producing works that emphasized ethical reflection, contemplative discipline, and moral growth while preserving channels for emotional depth, imaginative engagement, and ecstatic experience. Architecturally, Selim's reign left a profound imprint through the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations, spaces that simultaneously served functional, educational, and devotional purposes while symbolizing the moral and spiritual ideals of the era. Politically, his approach established enduring precedents for managing the intersection of spiritual and temporal authority. Selim's decisive confrontation with the Safavids and his careful regulation of domestic Sufi networks highlighted the inseparability of mystical influence and political stability, demonstrating that unregulated spiritual authority could have tangible consequences while loyal and disciplined orders could act as stabilizing and legitimizing forces. Subsequent Ottoman rulers drew upon this model, cultivating compliant and ethically grounded religious networks, guiding mystical practice, and managing ideological diversity in ways that balanced oversight with spiritual vitality. Part 23 also emphasizes the psychological and devotional impact of Selim's policies. Even within a regulated framework, believers maintained a deep longing for intimate, ecstatic, and personal experiences of the divine, expressed through local rituals, folk practices, poetic recitation, and musical devotion. This coexistence of oversight and personal freedom illustrates the adaptability and resilience of Sufi practice, showing that structured authority can guide but not extinguish the human impulse toward spiritual connection, reflection, and imaginative expression. Intellectual life under Selim was similarly shaped by these dynamics. Scholars, poets, and theologians engaged with questions of ethical cultivation, moral responsibility, and disciplined spiritual practice, producing works that addressed the tension between inward mystical reflection and outward conformity while maintaining symbolic, allegorical, and imaginative dimensions that allowed for creative and emotional engagement. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's reign represents a transformative chapter in Ottoman history, not only for its political consolidation and territorial expansion but also for its enduring impact on religious, cultural, and ethical life. By integrating mystical practice into the structures of governance, he created a society in which devotion, ethical responsibility, and social cohesion were mutually reinforcing, producing a model of resilient and adaptive spiritual culture. Part 23 highlights the continuing negotiation between authority and faith, illustrating that while power can shape, guide, and structure devotion, it cannot extinguish the innate human desire for divine connection, nor suppress creativity, reflection, and ethical growth. Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement left an indelible legacy, influencing institutions, culture, and individual conscience across generations, and demonstrating the intricate interplay of politics, spirituality, and human experience that defined the Ottoman world. Part 24 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series explores the long-lasting cultural, spiritual, and political consequences of Selim's reign, focusing on how his policies toward Sufi orders shaped Ottoman society and left a lasting imprint on religious practice, governance, and intellectual life. Selim's consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy and his strategic integration of Sufi institutions into the imperial administration established a model in which mystical authority was both respected and directed, allowing Sufi orders to flourish while ensuring that their influence reinforced political stability and moral cohesion. Orders such as the Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and Mevlevi became central instruments of this system, offering education, ethical guidance, charitable services, and mediation between the populace and the Sultan, while also embodying a model of devotion that emphasized discipline, ethical refinement, and loyalty. By combining patronage with careful oversight, Selim ensured that Sufism could expand institutionally and culturally without challenging the authority of the state, producing a spiritual environment in which ethical conduct and devotional practice were inseparable. At the same time, heterodox or politically disruptive movements, particularly those influenced by Safavid Sharia ideology or unregulated ecstatic rituals, were limited, demonstrating Selim's keen awareness of the potential consequences of unmonitored mystical authority. Socially, his policies shaped the lives of ordinary Muslims, who learned to internalize principles of self-discipline, moral responsibility, and communal loyalty as integral aspects of spiritual life. Families, local communities, and educational institutions became conduits for these teachings, creating a culture in which personal devotion, ethical behavior, and social cohesion were deeply intertwined. Cultural production thrived within this structured environment, with poets, musicians, storytellers, and scholars exploring the balance between personal mystical experience and state-aligned orthodoxy. Their works emphasized ethical reflection, moral cultivation, and disciplined devotion while retaining imaginative, allegorical, and emotional dimensions that allowed spirituality to remain vibrant and deeply felt. Architecturally and institutionally, Selim's reign left enduring marks through the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations. These spaces served not only functional purposes for worship, study, and community support but also symbolic roles, embodying the integration of spiritual aspiration with civic responsibility and moral order. Politically, Selim's engagement with Sufi orders and his decisive actions against the Safavids set important precedents for the interplay of spiritual and temporal authority. His campaigns and careful regulation of domestic Sufi networks demonstrated that unregulated mystical influence could pose tangible threats to political stability, while loyal, disciplined orders could act as stabilizing and legitimizing forces. Subsequent Ottoman rulers drew upon his model to cultivate controlled, ethical, and influential religious networks that reinforced governance while preserving the vitality of mystical practice. Part 24 also examines the psychological and devotional impact of Selim's policies. Despite the structured framework, human desire for intimate, ecstatic, and personal experiences of the divine persisted, expressed through folk rituals, local devotional practices, poetry, and music. This coexistence of oversight and personal freedom illustrates the resilience and adaptability of Sufi practice, showing that while authority can guide and shape spiritual life, it cannot extinguish the fundamental human longing for connection with the divine. Intellectually, Selim's reign inspired scholars, poets, and theologians to navigate the balance between inner spiritual reflection and outward conformity, producing works that emphasized ethical cultivation, disciplined meditation, and moral responsibility while preserving symbolic, allegorical, and imaginative spaces for mystical engagement. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's reign represents a transformative chapter in Ottoman history, not only in political and military terms but in shaping the moral, cultural, and spiritual architecture of the empire. By integrating mystical practice into governance, he created a society in which ethical devotion, social cohesion, and spiritual aspiration were mutually reinforcing, producing a resilient and adaptive cultural and religious legacy. Part 24 underscores the ongoing negotiation between power and faith, demonstrating that authority can structure and guide devotion but cannot extinguish the innate human desire for spiritual connection, nor suppress creativity, reflection, and emotional depth. Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement left an indelible mark on institutions, culture, and individual conscience, shaping generations of Ottoman subjects and embedding the interplay of politics, spirituality, and human experience into the fabric of the empire. Part 25 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series examines the enduring synthesis of political authority and mystical practice that defined Selim's reign, highlighting how his engagement with Sufi orders not only stabilized the empire but also reshaped the intellectual, cultural, and ethical life of Ottoman society. Selim's consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy, coupled with his strategic integration of influential Sufi orders into the administrative and spiritual framework of the state, created a model in which mysticism functioned as both a guide to personal morality and a mechanism for social cohesion. The Naqshbandi, Qadiri, Mevlevi, and other prominent orders thrived under this system, offering structured education, ethical instruction, charitable services, and mediation between ordinary believers and the Sultan, ensuring that devotional practice aligned with political loyalty, legal conformity, and communal stability. By combining generous patronage with careful oversight, Selim fostered an environment in which spiritual discipline and ethical refinement flourished without challenging the hierarchical structures of the state, producing a society in which moral responsibility, civic duty, and religious devotion were deeply intertwined. At the same time, Selim's policies curtailed heterodox or potentially disruptive movements, particularly those inspired by Shura Safavid ideology or unregulated ecstatic rituals, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of the political and doctrinal risks posed by unmonitored mystical influence. This dual approach of encouragement and regulation allowed Sufism to maintain its creative, emotional, and imaginative vitality while ensuring that its social and political impact reinforced stability and order. Socially, the effects of these policies were profound. Ordinary Muslims internalized principles of ethical conduct, disciplined devotion, and communal responsibility, learning to harmonize personal spiritual aspiration with the demands of family, neighborhood, and civic life. Schools, local communities, and Sufi lodges became channels for instilling these values, creating a culture in which morality, spiritual reflection, and social cohesion were inseparable. Cultural life during Selim's reign also reflected this synthesis. Poets, musicians, and storytellers engaged with the tension between personal mystical experience and state-aligned orthodoxy, producing literature, music, and narrative forms that emphasized ethical cultivation, moral reflection, and contemplative discipline while preserving imaginative, allegorical, and emotional dimensions of spiritual life. Architecturally and institutionally, Selim's influence manifested through the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable institutions that integrated aesthetic beauty with functional purpose, reinforcing the moral, spiritual, and civic ideals of the period. These physical spaces embodied the integration of devotion and social responsibility, serving as centers for learning, worship, and community service. Politically, Selim's management of Sufi orders and suppression of heterodox movements established enduring precedents for balancing spiritual authority with temporal power. His campaigns against the Safavids and the careful supervision of domestic mystical networks demonstrated that religious influence could directly affect political stability, while disciplined, loyal orders could serve as legitimizing and stabilizing forces. Later sultans and administrators followed his example, cultivating ethical, compliant religious networks that supported governance while preserving the vitality of spiritual practice. Part 25 also emphasizes the psychological and devotional dimensions of Selim's reforms. While institutionalized Sufism promoted reflection, ethical discipline, and structured devotion, human desire for ecstatic, intimate, and personal experience of the divine persisted. Folk rituals, regional devotional practices, and poetic and musical expressions continued to flourish, operating alongside official institutions and illustrating the resilience and adaptability of mystical life. This dynamic demonstrates that authority can guide and channel devotion but cannot extinguish the fundamental human longing for spiritual connection, emotional depth, and imaginative expression. Intellectual life under Selim similarly reflected these dynamics. Scholars, poets, and theologians grappled with the tension between inward mystical insight and outward conformity, producing works that emphasized moral cultivation, ethical responsibility, and disciplined reflection while retaining symbolic, allegorical, and imaginative spaces for creativity and spiritual exploration. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's engagement with the Sufi movement represents a transformative chapter in Ottoman history, shaping political authority, religious life, and cultural expression alike. By integrating mystical practice into governance, he created a society in which ethical devotion, social cohesion, and spiritual aspiration were mutually reinforcing, producing a resilient, adaptive, and morally coherent culture. Part 25 underscores the enduring negotiation between authority and spirituality, demonstrating that while power can structure, guide, and influence faith, it cannot extinguish the innate human drive for divine connection, nor suppress creativity, ethical reflection, and imaginative devotion. Selim's legacy endures as a testament to the intricate interplay of politics, religion, and culture, shaping institutions, human conscience, and collective experience for generations across the Ottoman world. Part 26 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series explores the long-reaching consequences of Selim's engagement with Sufi orders, emphasizing how his policies not only strengthened the Ottoman state but also profoundly shaped the spiritual, cultural, and intellectual life of the empire. Selim's consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy, coupled with his strategic integration of Sufi institutions into governance, established a framework in which mystical authority functioned as both a guide for ethical behavior and a mechanism for social cohesion. Orders such as the Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and Mevlevi were pivotal in this system, serving as centers for moral instruction, spiritual guidance, education, charitable works, and mediation between ordinary believers and the Sultan, ensuring that mystical practice aligned with social norms, political loyalty, and civic responsibility. By providing patronage while maintaining careful oversight, Selim fostered an environment in which Sufism could flourish institutionally and culturally without challenging the hierarchical authority of the state, producing a society in which ethical discipline, spiritual aspiration, and civic duty were deeply intertwined. At the same time, Selim's policies curtailed heterodox or politically disruptive movements, particularly those influenced by Safavid ideology or ecstatic, unregulated ritual practices, illustrating his keen understanding of the delicate balance between spiritual freedom and political stability. Socially, the impact of these reforms was significant, as ordinary Muslims internalized principles of moral responsibility, self-discipline, and communal loyalty, integrating spiritual reflection with everyday life. Families, local communities, and educational institutions acted as conduits for transmitting these values, producing a population in which devotion, morality, and civic engagement were inseparable. Cultural expression flourished alongside this structured spiritual framework. Poetry, music, storytelling, and other forms of art navigated the tension between personal mystical experience and state-aligned orthodoxy, producing works that emphasized ethical reflection, contemplative discipline, and moral cultivation while maintaining imaginative and emotional depth, preserving the human longing for intimate and transformative connection with the divine. Architecturally, Selim's influence was visible in the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations, blending functional, aesthetic, and symbolic purposes. These institutions served as centers for worship, learning, and communal service, embodying the integration of spiritual aspiration with social responsibility and reinforcing the moral and civic ideals promoted during his reign. Politically, Selim's strategies in managing Sufi orders and confronting heterodox movements established enduring precedents. His decisive campaigns against the Safavids and careful regulation of domestic Sufi networks demonstrated that mystical influence could affect political stability, while disciplined and loyal Sufi orders could serve as both stabilizing and legitimizing forces. Subsequent Ottoman rulers drew on these methods, cultivating religious networks that reinforced governance while preserving the vitality of mystical practice. Part 26 also highlights the psychological and devotional dimensions of Selim's policies. Even within structured frameworks, believers maintained a deep desire for ecstatic, intimate, and personal encounters with the divine, expressed through folk rituals, localized devotional practices, poetry, and music. This coexistence of oversight and personal freedom illustrates the adaptability and resilience of mystical practice, showing that authority can guide and shape spiritual life but cannot extinguish the innate human drive for spiritual connection, reflection, and imaginative expression. Intellectually, Selim's reign inspired scholars, theologians, and poets to engage with the tension between inward spiritual insight and outward social conformity, producing works that emphasized ethical cultivation, disciplined meditation, and moral responsibility while preserving allegorical and symbolic spaces for contemplation and creative expression. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's reign represents a transformative moment in Ottoman history, influencing political authority, religious life, and cultural expression alike. By integrating Sufi practice into the structures of governance, he created a society in which ethical devotion, social cohesion, and spiritual aspiration were mutually reinforcing, producing a resilient, adaptive, and morally coherent culture. Part 26 underscores the enduring negotiation between power and faith, demonstrating that while authority can structure, guide, and influence mystical practice, it cannot extinguish the innate human yearning for divine connection, nor suppress creativity, ethical reflection, and imaginative devotion. Selim's legacy continues to resonate across generations, shaping institutions, culture, and individual conscience, and illustrating the complex interplay of politics, spirituality, and human experience within the Ottoman world. Part 27 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series delves into the lasting spiritual, cultural, and political ramifications of Selim's reign, emphasizing the ways in which his engagement with Sufi orders reshaped Ottoman society and left an enduring legacy on religious, intellectual, and civic life. Sultan Selim's consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy, coupled with his strategic incorporation of Sufi institutions into the administrative and moral frameworks of the state, created a model in which mystical authority functioned as both a source of personal ethical guidance and a stabilizing influence on social and political structures. The Naqshbandi, Qadiri, Mevlevi, and other influential orders became central to this system, providing education, spiritual mentorship, charitable services, and mediation between ordinary believers and the Sultan, ensuring that devotional practice reinforced political loyalty, ethical conduct, and communal cohesion. Through a combination of generous patronage and careful oversight, Selim fostered an environment in which Sufism could thrive institutionally and culturally, cultivating a society in which moral responsibility, spiritual reflection, and civic duty were deeply intertwined, while simultaneously imposing limits on heterodox or politically destabilizing movements, particularly those inspired by Shiraz Safavid ideology or unregulated ecstatic rituals, reflecting a nuanced understanding of the interplay between spiritual freedom and political authority. Socially, these policies shaped the daily lives of ordinary Muslims, who internalized principles of self-discipline, ethical behavior, and communal loyalty as integral to spiritual practice. Families, local communities, and educational institutions acted as channels for transmitting these values, producing a culture in which ethical, devotional, and civic ideals were inseparable. Cultural and intellectual life during Selim's reign flourished within this framework, as poets, musicians, storytellers, and scholars explored the tension between personal mystical experience and state-aligned orthodoxy, producing works that emphasized moral reflection, ethical cultivation, and contemplative discipline while preserving imaginative, symbolic, and emotional dimensions that allowed spirituality to remain deeply felt and transformative. Architecturally, Selim's influence manifested in the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations, which blended functionality with aesthetic and symbolic significance. These institutions served as centers for worship, learning, communal support, and spiritual reflection, embodying the integration of devotion with civic responsibility and reinforcing the moral, spiritual, and social ideals of his reign. Politically, Selim's strategies for managing Sufi orders and confronting heterodox movements established lasting precedents for balancing spiritual authority with state power. His decisive campaigns against the Safavids and careful supervision of domestic mystical networks demonstrated that unregulated mystical influence could threaten political stability, while disciplined and loyal Sufi orders could act as legitimizing and stabilizing forces. Later Ottoman rulers drew upon his example, cultivating ethically oriented, compliant religious networks while maintaining the vitality of spiritual practice, illustrating the durability of Selim's model across generations. Part 27 also highlights the psychological and devotional consequences of Selim's policies. Even within a structured framework, believers continued to seek ecstatic, intimate, and personal experiences of the divine, expressed through folk rituals, local devotional practices, poetry, and music. This coexistence of structured oversight and personal freedom illustrates the resilience and adaptability of mystical practice, showing that authority can guide and shape devotion but cannot extinguish the innate human drive for spiritual connection, imaginative expression, and ethical reflection. Intellectually, Selim's reign inspired scholars, poets, and theologians to grapple with the balance between inward mystical insight and outward social conformity, producing works that emphasized ethical cultivation, disciplined meditation, and moral responsibility while preserving symbolic, allegorical, and imaginative spaces for contemplation and creative engagement. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's reign represents a transformative moment in Ottoman history, influencing political authority, religious life, and cultural expression alike. By integrating Sufi practice into the structures of governance, he created a society in which ethical devotion, social cohesion, and spiritual aspiration were mutually reinforcing, producing a resilient, adaptive, and morally coherent culture. Part 27 underscores the enduring negotiation between authority and spirituality, demonstrating that while power can guide, shape, and structure mystical practice, it cannot extinguish the fundamental human yearning for divine connection, nor suppress creativity, ethical reflection, and imaginative devotion. Selim's legacy endures across generations, shaping institutions, culture, and individual conscience, and illuminating the intricate interplay of politics, religion, and human experience that define the Ottoman world. Part 28 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series examines the lasting influence of Selim's reign on the spiritual, cultural, and political dimensions of the Ottoman Empire, focusing on how his policies toward Sufi orders shaped the ethical, intellectual, and civic life of the society for generations. Sultan Selim's consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy, combined with his careful integration of Sufi institutions into the imperial framework, created a system in which mystical authority was both respected and directed, allowing Sufism to flourish while aligning its influence with state objectives. Prominent orders such as the Naqshbandi, Qadiri, Mevlevi, and others became pivotal actors in this structure, offering spiritual guidance, ethical instruction, educational opportunities, charitable works, and mediation between the populace and the Sultan, ensuring that mystical practice contributed to social stability, political loyalty, and moral cohesion. By offering patronage while maintaining careful oversight, Selim fostered an environment in which spiritual discipline, ethical refinement, and devotional life could thrive institutionally and culturally, creating a society in which morality, personal devotion, and civic responsibility were closely interwoven. At the same time, he limited heterodox or politically destabilizing movements, particularly those inspired by Shura Safavid ideology or unregulated ecstatic rituals, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of the potential consequences of unmonitored mystical influence and the delicate balance between spiritual freedom and political stability. Socially, these policies shaped the daily lives of ordinary Muslims, who internalized principles of self-discipline, moral responsibility, and loyalty to communal norms as inseparable elements of their spiritual practice. Families, educational institutions, and local communities became conduits for transmitting these values, fostering a culture in which ethical behavior, devotional engagement, and civic duty were inseparable. Cultural expression flourished alongside this regulated spiritual environment. Poets, musicians, storytellers, and scholars explored the tension between personal mystical experience and state-aligned orthodoxy, producing literature, music, and narrative forms that emphasized moral reflection, ethical cultivation, and contemplative discipline while retaining imaginative, emotional, and allegorical dimensions, preserving the depth and vitality of human spiritual experience. Architecturally, Selim's reign left an enduring legacy through the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations, which combined functional purpose with aesthetic and symbolic significance. These structures served as centers for worship, learning, community service, and spiritual reflection, embodying the integration of devotion, ethical conduct, and social responsibility in tangible, enduring forms. Politically, Selim's strategies for managing Sufi orders and suppressing heterodox movements established enduring models for balancing spiritual authority with temporal power. His decisive campaigns against the Safavids and careful oversight of domestic mystical networks demonstrated that mystical influence could affect political stability, while disciplined, loyal orders could serve as stabilizing and legitimizing forces. Subsequent Ottoman rulers drew upon his example, cultivating controlled, ethically guided religious networks that supported governance while preserving the vitality of mystical practice, ensuring the durability of Selim's policies across generations. Part 28 also emphasizes the psychological and devotional effects of Selim's reforms. Even within a structured framework, believers continued to seek ecstatic, intimate, and personal encounters with the divine, expressed through folk rituals, regional devotional practices, poetry, and music. This coexistence of oversight and personal freedom illustrates the resilience, adaptability, and enduring appeal of mystical practice, showing that while authority can guide and structure spiritual life, it cannot extinguish the human longing for divine connection, imaginative expression, or ethical reflection. Intellectually, Selim's reign inspired scholars, theologians, and poets to grapple with the tension between inner mystical insight and outward social conformity, producing works that emphasized ethical cultivation, disciplined meditation, and moral responsibility while maintaining symbolic, allegorical, and imaginative spaces for creative and spiritual engagement. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's reign represents a transformative period in Ottoman history, not only for its political and military achievements but also for the profound ways in which it shaped religious, cultural, and moral life. By integrating mystical practice into governance, he created a society in which ethical devotion, social cohesion, and spiritual aspiration were mutually reinforcing, producing a resilient, adaptive, and morally coherent culture. Part 28 underscores the enduring negotiation between authority and spirituality, demonstrating that while power can guide, shape, and structure mystical practice, it cannot extinguish the fundamental human yearning for divine connection, nor suppress creativity, reflection, and devotional depth. Selim's legacy continues to influence institutions, culture, and individual conscience, illuminating the complex and enduring interplay of politics, religion, and human experience across the Ottoman world. Part 29 of the Sultan Selim and the Sufi Movement series delves into the deep and lasting ramifications of Sultan Selim's policies on Sufi orders, highlighting how his strategic vision transformed the Ottoman Empire's religious, cultural, and political landscape while leaving a profound legacy for generations. Selim's consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy and careful integration of influential Sufi institutions into the administrative and moral framework of the empire created a system in which mystical authority was both respected and directed, allowing Sufism to flourish while reinforcing political stability and ethical conduct. Prominent orders such as the Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and Mevlevi became central to this vision, serving as hubs for spiritual guidance, moral instruction, educational development, charitable activities, and mediation between the populace and the sultan, ensuring that devotional practice remained aligned with loyalty, communal cohesion, and social responsibility. Through a combination of generous patronage and disciplined oversight, Selim fostered an environment in which ethical discipline, contemplative reflection, and devotional engagement could coexist with state authority, producing a society in which moral responsibility, spiritual aspiration, and civic duty were deeply interwoven. At the same time, Selim restricted heterodox or potentially destabilizing movements, particularly those inspired by Safavid Sharia ideology or unregulated ecstatic practices, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of the delicate balance between spiritual freedom and political control and the consequences of unmonitored mystical influence. On a social level, these policies shaped the everyday spiritual and ethical life of Ottoman subjects, who internalized principles of moral conduct, self-discipline, and communal loyalty as inseparable from their religious practice. Families, educational institutions, and local communities became conduits for these teachings, fostering a culture in which devotion, morality, and civic engagement were mutually reinforcing and inseparable from one another. Cultural life during Selim's reign reflected this synthesis of authority and spirituality, as poets, musicians, storytellers, and scholars navigated the tension between personal mystical experience and state-aligned orthodoxy, producing literature, music, and narratives that emphasized ethical reflection, moral cultivation, and contemplative discipline while retaining imaginative, symbolic, and emotional depth, ensuring that spirituality remained vibrant and deeply human. Architecturally, Selim's influence endured through the construction and endowment of mosques, Sufi lodges, madrasas, and charitable foundations, blending functional, aesthetic, and symbolic purposes. These institutions served as centers of worship, learning, and community support, embodying the integration of devotion, moral cultivation, and social responsibility and reinforcing the ethical and spiritual ideals that underpinned his reign. Politically, Selim's management of Sufi orders and suppression of heterodox elements set enduring precedents for balancing religious influence with state power. His decisive campaigns against the Safavids and careful regulation of domestic mystical networks demonstrated that mystical authority could directly affect political stability, while disciplined, loyal Sufi orders could act as legitimizing and stabilizing forces. Later sultans adopted these methods to cultivate compliant, ethically grounded religious networks that reinforced governance while preserving the creative and spiritual vitality of mystical practice, demonstrating the lasting relevance of Selim's approach. Part 29 also highlights the psychological and devotional impact of these policies. Even within a regulated framework, believers maintained a desire for ecstatic, intimate, and personal experiences of the divine, expressed through folk rituals, regional devotional practices, poetry, and music. This coexistence of structured oversight and personal spiritual freedom illustrates the resilience and adaptability of Sufi practice, showing that while authority can guide and structure devotion, it cannot extinguish the innate human longing for divine connection, imaginative reflection, and ethical growth. Intellectually, Selim's reign encouraged scholars, poets, and theologians to engage with the tension between inner mystical insight and outward social conformity, producing works that emphasized disciplined meditation, ethical cultivation, and moral responsibility while maintaining symbolic, allegorical, and imaginative spaces for creative and contemplative engagement. In conclusion, Sultan Selim's reign represents a transformative period in Ottoman history, affecting political authority, religious life, and cultural expression alike. By integrating Sufi practice into governance, he created a society in which ethical devotion, social cohesion, and spiritual aspiration were mutually reinforcing, producing a resilient, adaptive, and morally coherent culture. Part 29 underscores the enduring interplay between power and spirituality, demonstrating that while authority can structure, guide, and influence mystical practice, it cannot extinguish the fundamental human desire for divine connection, nor suppress creativity, ethical reflection, and emotional depth. Selim's legacy continues to resonate across generations, shaping institutions, culture, and individual conscience, and illuminating the complex and enduring relationship between politics, religion, and human experience in the Ottoman world.